Okay, so this is the audio review for Exam 1, Intro to Criminology. Okay, so when it comes to pre-classical perspectives of crime and punishment, for the majority of human civilization, we thought that criminal activity was caused by some sort of supernatural or religious force, right? Like you have the devil in you. Some common punishments during the Middle Ages included things like being quartered, stoning, burning alive at the stake, torture, beheading, all those kind of fun things. The social contract is just the idea that people will follow rules that are, well, basically, if a society will protect people, they will give up some of their freedom and follow the rules so that they can get protection in return for following the rules. Let's see. Human beings are rational, have free will. Basically, that's that Hobbesian argument that is the basis of utilitarianism and also kind of the basis of Beccaria's model of deterrence, right? Is that people are rational and they have free will, so therefore you can convince them to not commit a crime if you point out, the negatives of it. If you can deter someone from committing a crime in the first place because they're thoughtful and rational as to whether they commit a crime. All right, keeping going. Let's see, utilitarianism. So utilitarianism is just the idea that you should have the most benefit for the most amount of people. When it came to punishment for Beccaria, he basically said that a crime should be punished equally regardless of the context or circumstance. So, if you stole something, it didn't really matter why you stole it, that you should be punished the same way. Everyone should be punished the same way for stealing, right? When it comes to the death penalty, he was against it just because he didn't think it was efficient or effective. Plus, he said it really violates the social contract because instead of society protecting a person, society is killing a person. So he said, it's not effective as a punishment if you just kill somebody, right? Meaning it was too quick. 3 key elements of punishment for Beccaria was celerity, right? The swiftness of a punishment. The certainty of punishment, right? The likelihood you think you're actually going to be punished, which he thought was probably the most important. And the severity of punishment, meaning that the penalty that you get for a crime, right, the consequence to your action has to be worse than whatever the benefit you could get from it. Let's see. So that's how he develops this kind of deterrence model. So specific deterrence is deterrence that focuses on an individual. So like if you're speeding down the road and you get a speeding ticket, that's specific deterrence. It's supposed to deter you from speeding in the future. But general deterrence is when other people are deterred because of the punishment of the individual. So meaning you're driving down the freeway and you see someone getting pulled over by the police, it reminds you to slow down, right? Because you don't want to get a ticket because you see what's happening to them. Alrighty, so the classical school of criminology was basically saying, hey, if people are rational and have free will, maybe we should change the system based on that, instead of just, there's a devil in somebody, let's crack their head open to get the devil out. They propose some reforms that could be done to the justice system, which kind of form the basis of our Bill of Rights, and our modern system is built off of those reforms. The neoclassical school, really the difference between the two is that in the classical school, punishment is just across the board for whatever it is. It doesn't matter why you did something, it just matters that you did it, right? Versus the neoclassical school is going to kind of consider the context of why you did something. So like for stealing, going back to that example from before, did you steal because you were starving, or did you steal because you just felt like it, right? Like maybe there should be a different penalty based on why you did something, right? That's the real difference there. All right, moving on, chapter 3. So rational choice theory just emphasizes the factors that go into a person's decision to either commit crime or not. Um, the most important finding of rational choice theory is basically that if you think you're going to get caught, then that's going to have a significant impact on whether or not you decide to commit a crime, right? Let's see, 3 factors. Basically, that's just the motivated offenders, right? The suitable targets and lack of guardianship. Hotspots are just when there's a convergence of those 3 factors of routine activities theory. Let's see, what else? Oh, lifestyles perspective. So basically, this just says that the likelihood that you have of becoming a victim or becoming a criminal, either way, has to do with the kind of lifestyle that you engage in, right? So basically, like the example I gave was if you're elderly and you're in at night, you're probably not as likely to be the victim of a crime. So it's basically like a high risk, low risk based on your own lifestyle. You either are more at risk of being victimized or less. Let's see, policy implications. So broken windows, we talked about how it makes sense as a building metaphor, but when it comes to policing, it just emphasizes the need to crack down on minor offenses to reduce more major crimes in the future. But there are controversies about whether or not that's effective. Also, 3 strikes was another policy that was put in place because of rational choice that basically says, you know, if you say, okay, the 3rd time you're going to get 25 to life, that's going to deter people from committing those crimes. But again, like we saw in the video, it's not that great as an actual deterrent, but that's why it's there, right? The idea is that it'll deter people from committing that 3rd crime, because then they'll be locked up forever. Let's see, eugenics. So basically, eugenics was just trying to say that there was a racial hierarchy, like biologically, of superior and inferior people. Basically just trying to create like a scientific argument for something that was really a social prejudice and racism. So, but again, it wasn't something that was just like Nazi Germany's problem. Like California kind of pioneered something called the California experiment that developed ways to sterilize people based on either, mental, perceived mental deficiencies of low IQ, or because of perceived promiscuity, because of being a racial or ethnic minority, because of being affiliated with the criminal justice system, etc. So basically, just justifying the ability to sterilize people so they could never have children in an effort to try to increase, favorability in the gene pool. But of course, coming from a very racist angle. Let's see here, craniometry. Okay, so craniometry is basically, you thought that basically the size of the brain or the skull represented superiority or inferiority within people. But of course, this was based on racial ethnic grouping. So again, they knew which racial ethnic groups were which, and they said, oh, well, the shape of the European head, that's the best way, because they were also European. Let's see, craniometry, the measuring methods. They do some weird stuff. So they'd measure some people that were alive. They'd measure people that were recently dead, and even some people that had been dead for a long time. They would just fill their heads with like pebbles or some crap, or ball bearings or something random, seed, and then weigh that to see what the inside would have weighed, I guess. Science, I guess. But anyway, let's see. Oh, phrenology was the idea, it's the science of thinking about human dispositions based on the distinctions in your skull. So dispositions like your personality, how you act, what you do, based on your skull. So part of this was the idea that the shape of your skull conformed to the shape of your brain. So if you had like a weird knot on one part of your head, that there's also like a deformity in that part of your brain. Cool. That one's that one. Oh, and then physiognomy was the study of facial or other bodily aspects that was supposed to indicate some sort of developmental problem, such as criminality. Lombroso's theory of atavism basically is saying that if someone's a criminal, they're like an evolutionary throwback. They don't have control over their actions. They're just biologically inferior, and that's why they're committing crimes. He said, yeah, there's also other types of offenders, what he called criminaloids, which was, I don't know, a way of saying people that were committing crime because of some environmental reason. Like, again, starvation means you steal food. And then the mentally ill. Let's see, stigmata. Again, not the weird Catholic thing. He basically typically just saw it as any facial or bodily feature that deviated from the norm, though he did change them over time. So having like big ears or small ears, or a big chin or a small chin, or, you know, stuff like that. Determinism is just the assumption that most of human behavior is determined by factors beyond free will and free choice. Let's see. Somatyping was this idea that your actual body size and shape relates to your likelihood of criminality. And it's kind of like atavism, because he was saying that people that are mesomorphs or athletic were more likely to be criminals. They were also considered somewhat an evolutionary throwback. All right, moving on. Code of the Street, Chapter 1. I mean, obviously, social learning theory relates, because, again, if you grow up in a situation where there's other values being taught that aren't the dominant social class values, like, so, for example, if some of the kids are growing up decent and they're learning middle class value systems, but if the other kids are growing up straight, so they're learning to, like, disrespect authority, to not trust law enforcement, etc., then that's what's going to become normal, right? So if you see a lot of crime, if you see a lot of people selling drugs, that just becomes normal, because what you see is what reality becomes, right? And so how we learn these things from our social environment affects what we see as normal in our social environment. All right, so people in the Code of the Street characterize the neighborhood as two polar opposites, right, as decent or street, but it's a little bit more fluid than that, because sometimes people are decent and then sometimes they're street. And also, it's just not as clear a distinct category as they say it is, but it is a label they use to characterize themselves and others. But in reality, families often have both street or decent people in them. When it comes to street-oriented, just the idea that because the residents don't have a good education, they don't have an outlook past immediate circumstances, meaning you don't have a future to look forward to. It causes a lot of contempt and anger, and then having to come up with issues, or like facing hyper-policing or criminal justice system issues. It just develops a kind of distaste or contempt for police and for the system, and kind of this culture, this like thug life culture created out of this. It's just rejecting mainstream middle-class white society values, right? And all of that's coming out of this relationship between the social and economic system within the area. Meaning, of course, people are going to be angry and pissed when they have no opportunities, right, when they're struggling. Inclination to violence as a result of life circumstances. So again, living in a marginal area with very little jobs and very few accesses to public services, the drug trade itself becomes a daily phenomenon where you're not just seeing the drugs being sold, but you're seeing the violence around the drug trade, and oftentimes shootings, killings, things of that nature. And so it causes like an alienation and a hope, and a loss of hope for the future. All right, so then Code of the Street. So what is it? Right? It's just that kind of feature of regulating your behavior in the neighborhood to protect yourself. Again, why is it important? To protect yourself. And that's whether you're street or whether you're decent. You got to know it so that you can survive it. When it comes to decent families, they're very, often patriarchal households. So there's this role of the man of the house, which, has this general expectation that men have to be strong. They have to be the financial provider, right? Tied into the kind of hegemonic norms of masculinity. That women and children have to be passive and obedient to the man of the house. And so part of this includes also having to physically protect the family from altercations. When it comes to street-oriented women and parenting, they're often, dealing with their own stuff. They might be addicted to drugs and just abandon their children. Some of them parent, but they do it, not consistently like an actual parent. They just kind of like sometimes parent, sometimes don't. So it's more sporadic. Also, the kids, because of the situation, are in a situation where they realize they have to fight for themselves and no one's really going to protect them. So they end up fighting a lot more and kind of like hanging out in street peer cultures, developing street friends and street families from a very young age. So, they come up a lot harder than other kids because they're fighting already. When it comes to social norms, these are just the specific expectations of how to act in a situation. And obviously the norms of the street are being affected by the environment of the neighborhood. All right, so for chapter 2, social capital, that's just having, a social group that brings you social rewards in society, right? We talked about like if you're a college student, but you have like family or close friends that already went to college before you, they can help you register, help you understand what's expected of you. So you get that social capital of already knowing what to do versus those people that are first generation. Their parents might not be able to help them because they don't know how to do it or how to navigate it. So it becomes more of a barrier people have to get over. So having social capital in the code of the street means, having that respect gives you power. Let's see here. Socialization. So socialization is just how we learn the values and norms of our culture. And it starts with our parents or our, immediate family when we're children. But eventually, once we hit adolescence, our peers become a very strong influence on what we think is, our values or norms or what we do, how we act, what behaviors we think are appropriate. So the street can overwhelm decent socialization. So obviously, even if a kid has been raised to follow the rules and adhere to certain social conventions, the fact that you can make so much money in the underground economy that you can't make legitimately, and there's such a scarcity of legitimate jobs, and it just kind of leads to the situation where, the lure of the street, the economic lure, also the lure of having power and status and protection from being victimized, can really overwhelm that decent socialization of like, okay, it's wrong to use violence. Juice is just a person's share of respect on the street that you have to fight to increase, and really just protect from anyone trying to take it away from you. What protects a person is the number of friends that they have that will avenge them and the status of those friends. To campaign is just to raise your status by putting down other people, right? So this often involves physical items like taking a hat off someone's head and putting it on your head, or taking the shoes off someone's feet, because it's not just about taking it, it's about humiliating the person and taking that social power over them, which gives you more status and power. Bystander effect is this weird phenomenon, right, where oftentimes we won't get involved in an incident because we assume someone else will, right? So the more people present, like let's say in a situation of violence, like the Kitty Genovese example, all like 38 neighbors watched her get murdered, but no one called the police because they all assumed someone else did. So our responsibility to act is diffused when there's more people present in a situation. When it comes to manhood and nerve, basically it's important to be able to be willing to, not just to commit violence, but also be willing to kill a person, to be willing to die, is really linked not just to, that status, but really to masculinity, to this performance of what men are expected to do under the code of the street. All right, moving into chapter 8. So, basically, Park was saying that in his principles of city growth, he was saying that the city is like a complex organism. And so, the citizens depend on each other just like how, cells within an organism depend on each other for that, particular thing to function. So he said that, in all of these cities, there was these natural areas, these clusters, and that basically some of the areas tend to invade other areas, which is kind of like he was saying, like, if you look at the natural kingdom, you have the situation where invasive species will come in from an area where they don't have any predators, so they overwhelm in areas. So he basically compares, certain principles of city growth to that kind of natural phenomenon of, if there's some sort of, what's it called? A invasive species or a group coming in that, basically the whole system has to adapt to that new group. All right, so concentric circles is just the idea that, like, there's a growth of the city from the inside outward, and that each time there's a growth within the zone, it puts stress on the next zone to expand more outward. Let's see, social disorganization theory. So basically, it starts with the assumption that certain neighborhoods in all cities have more crime than others, and that it has to do with certain characteristics of the neighborhood, right? Like poverty, physical dilapidation, heterogeneity, which is just a nice way of saying like mixed groups of people. And that basically, if you have those factors, it leads to a state of social disorganization, which leads to crime and delinquency. Culture and subculture theories. So basically, they're just trying to say that there's certain groups in society that socialize their children to believe that engaging in criminality is okay, right? So if you grew up in that some kind of subculture, then you're not going to interpret crime the same way as someone who is socialized differently. Miller's 6 focal concerns. So, those 6 were fate. Basically just feeling like you're dealing with what life is dealt to you. Autonomy. Valuing independence from authority. Trouble, which is just trying to stay out of legal trouble. Toughness, or maintaining your reputation on the street. Excitement, right? That sometimes, doing something illegal kind of gives you a little spark of something. And smartness, really an emphasis on street smarts. So those are the 6, and you just got to spot the one that isn't one of those 6 that I put in there. And that's pretty much that. So hopefully this is a helpful review for your studying.